morning. Let's just take a moment and place ourselves in God's presence. Saint Thérèse. When Thérèse was lying on her deathbed, she said to one of her blood sisters, if the saints came back to earth, most of them would not recognize themselves by what we say and by what we write about them. She also said that for a saint to be a model in her life, she had to see their real life and not their imagined life. Thérèse had no use for a sentimental portrayal of the saints. In fact, she also says in the last conversations that most of the sermons that she heard on the Blessed Mother in Lisieux, Carmel, she had absolutely no use for, because they put Mary so much on a pedestal that she could not see Mary's real life, but the imagined life. There's a real irony in these statements of Saint Thérèse, considering that few saints have fallen victim to as much sentimentality as Saint Thérèse herself. And part of the reason has to do with her entree into the world, namely her autobiography, The Story of a Soul. Bishop Guy Goucher, in his biography of Saint Thérèse, writes, quote, Thérèse fell victim to an excess of sentimental devotion, which betrayed her. She was victim also to her own language, which was that of the late 19th century and flowed from the religiosity of her age, a handicap to be overcome. I know for the first 20 years as a Carmelite, I had to take an insulin shot before I would pick up the autobiography of Saint Thérèse. In fact, there's even on the net, there is a website entitled Thérèsophobia, for those who have a problem with Saint Thérèse. Barry Ulanoff, in his biography of Saint Thérèse, writes that he marveled at Thérèse's realism once he was able to get under, quote, a sea of sentimentality. Realism is not a word that we often associate with Saint Thérèse, but if we're able to get below the surface and see the unvarnished truth of her life, we will discover a flesh and blood human being who struggled with the human condition. A person who was traumatized by the death of her mother when Thérèse was 4.5, a trauma that she actually took to the grave with her, of being plagued with debilitating scruples that she never worked through. As an adolescent, of having her father institutionalized in a mental asylum. Her crisis of faith, where in the last 18 months of her life, she doubted whether there was an afterlife. And as far as we know, that's the state in which she died. We have no evidence to indicate otherwise. Living with very difficult people, some of which were mentally ill that had to be institutionalized, and dying a very, very painful death of tuberculosis at the age of 24. The main focus of this all too brief presentation on Thérèse will focus on three events of her life: the death of her mother, her martyrdom of scrupulosity, and her trial of faith. All three were the cause of deep emotional suffering for Thérèse, All three were the context in which she grew in holiness. And all three were wounds, to one extent or another, that Thérèse took to the grave with her. She never, quote, completely worked through or was healed of her childhood wounds. I'm not of the school that as we grow in holiness, there is always a corresponding emotional and psychological healing. Sometimes there is, and sometimes there isn't. And I don't even know if God wants us to be completely healed in this lifetime. Suffering is a mystery. Our wounds, like Thérèse, may be the context of our growth in holiness because they're the areas in our lives in which we have to make the most excruciating choices and where we are called to utterly rely upon the grace of God. But before we look at these three areas in Thérèse's life, I'd like to just take about 5 minutes and mention some of the basic facts of Thérèse's life, especially for those of you who might not be familiar with the life of Saint Thérèse. Thérèse was born on January 2nd, 1873 in Lisieux, France, in a pious, upper-middle-class family. Her father, Louis, was a watchmaker by profession, who once aspired to join the abbey, the monastery of St. Bernard's in the Alps, but was refused because of an ignorance of Latin. Thérèse's mother, Zélie Guérin, was a lace maker by profession. She had her own business. She employed more than 20 women in her business. And likewise, she aspired to be a religious of the Sisters of St. Vincent de Paul, but was dissuaded for reasons of health. Louis and Zélie had 9 children, 4 of whom died, and the 5 girls that survived all became nuns. 3 of Thérèse's blood sisters, Marie, Pauline, and Céline, lived with Thérèse in Lisieux, Carmel. There was also Léonie, who became a visitation nun, somebody who was mentally slow, who had a very disruptive personality, whom Thérèse calls in her autobiography, Poor Léonie. She's writing to her sisters. That's kind of shorthand for everything that happened in their childhood. Thérèse was brought up in a very Catholic home. Daily Mass was the practice of both parents. Sunday was reserved for a day of worship, not only Mass, but Vespers in the evening. But the Martin family wasn't just a pious family, it was a very charitable family. And this is an aspect that you will not pick up in Thérèse's autobiography, Story of a Soul. For example, Louis founded and was very active in the local chapter of the St. Vincent de Paul Society in Lisieux. His involvement entailed a considerable amount of time negotiating and haggling with government departments attempting to find shelter or medical assistance for street people. Louis was always picking up alcoholics out of the gutter and bringing them home, sobering them up, giving them a meal and clothing. Zélie, likewise, who was a third-order Franciscan, as a Carmelite, we were kind of embarrassed about this, but anyways, she was a third-order Franciscan. She helped to nurse the sick of the neighborhood. And the impact that this home atmosphere had upon Thérèse can be summed up in one sentence in her autobiography, quote, "Having nothing but good example around me, I naturally wanted to follow it." When Thérèse's mother died, when Thérèse was 4.5 years old, the family moved to Lisieux. It was an offer from Zélie's brother, Isidore, and his wife. I mean, here's Louis. He's a single dad with 5 girls to raise. So they rented a house next to Isidore and his wife, and they helped raise the kids. Thérèse attended the Benedictine boarding school for 5 years in Lisieux, and in her autobiography, she terms this the saddest years of her life. When Thérèse was 10 and a half years old, Thérèse's second mother, who was her older sister Pauline, left home and entered Carmel. This was so traumatic for Thérèse, it was almost like a second death. In fact, for 6 weeks, Thérèse was bedridden. She had hallucinations. She was paranoid. She actually believed her sisters were going to poison her. I mean, isn't it wonderful that even the saints were as neurotic as we are? You know? At age 12 and a half, Thérèse attended a retreat at the Benedictine school, an experience that was so terrifying that it triggered a major attack of scruples that she suffered for 18 months. Thérèse entered the Carmelite convent at the age of 15 and died a very painful death due to tuberculosis at the age of 24. And in her final illness, because of the great pain she was suffering, and because of her trial of faith, she writes in the last conversations, "I wonder why more atheists don't commit suicide. Without faith, I would have committed suicide in an instant." In fact, she actually asked her sister to take the medicine off the table next to her bed because she said maybe in a moment of pain, she might have taken that medicine. I find it very comforting to know that even the saints know what it means to want it to be all over with. Have you ever considered how much an exercise of faith it is to choose to stay alive and just to slug it out through another day? When you want to have it all over with, pray to Thérèse. She truly understands. And to all appearances in Carmel, to some of the nuns, Thérèse was a mediocre religious. So much so that when Thérèse was dying, one of the nuns said, quote, "Sister Thérèse will die soon. What will Mother Prioress be able to write about her in her obituary? She entered our convent, she lived and died. There's nothing else you can say. We cannot even say that she was a good religious. For we never saw her practicing virtue." And deliberately so. She kept her deeds of mercy secret. If you want a good goal in your life, try to live in such a way that when people look at you, they'll say, "Now there's a mediocre Catholic." I didn't say be one. I mean, there's a deep transformation of the ego, of how we present ourselves before the world, that Thérèse went through. Now, let us turn to the first major crisis in Thérèse's life, and that was the death of her mother, Zélie, that Thérèse suffered when she was 4.5 years old. There are certain events in our life, be they births or deaths, divorces, critical life choices, that cut our life in two. Events that emotionally define the words before and after. Definitive moments after which we know that life will never be the same again. The death of Thérèse's mother was such an event for Thérèse. Her death was so traumatic that Thérèse defines the chapters of her life in relationship to her mother's death. The first period of my life extends from the dawn of my reason until my mother's departure in heaven. The second period extends from the age of 4.5, when my mother died, to that of 14, the time when I once again found my childhood character and entered more and more into the serious side of life. In short, Zélie's became the inner emotional reference point for Thérèse. The first period of her life was how Thérèse experienced herself before her mother died. The second period was how she was after her mother died. And the third period was how she was when she regained what she had lost at the time that Zélie died. The death of Thérèse's mother completely changed Thérèse's personality. She writes, quote, "My happy disposition completely changed after Mama's death. I, once so full of life, became timid and retiring, sensitive to an excessive degree. One look was enough to reduce me to tears. And the only way I was content was to be left alone completely. I could not bear the company of strangers and found my joy only within the intimacy of the family." To give some explanation for this drastic change in Thérèse, we need to look at Thérèse's history of early childhood separations from mother and mother figures before Zélie died. When Thérèse was 3 months old, Thérèse was separated from Zélie. Because of poor health, she refused to nurse from Zélie. Zélie was brought to a wet nurse, Rose Foley, who lived on a farm several miles from Lisieux. And Thérèse lived with Rose for 11 months. And during this first critical year of life, when the foundation of personality is laid, as we would expect, Thérèse bonded with Rose as mother. And we have evidence to this. For example, often when Rose would come into Lisieux on market day, she would drop Thérèse off at the Martin household. But often they had to bring Thérèse down to the market to be with Rose, because as Thérèse is sitting on her biological mother's lap, she's crying for her mother. In Thérèse's mind, Rose was mother. Also, we have another incident, and we see this in one of Zélie's letters. One day when Rose brought Thérèse to the Martin household, there were several employees of Zélie's lace business that were present. All of them were peasant women, like Rose. And Zélie writes, quote, "Working women are coming to me each moment, and I was giving Thérèse to one and then to another. Thérèse really wanted to see them even more than to see me. And she kissed them several times. Country women dressed like the wet nurse. This is the world that she needs and wants." I mean, even Zélie recognized this. Well, what happens after those 11 months? She's taken away from Rose. She's taken away from her emotional mother and brought back to Zélie. Thus, Thérèse suffered 2 separations from mother figures during the first critical year of life. And one of the accompanying effects of such separations is that it engenders in a child a pervasive apprehensiveness that the child will be abandoned again. And this may have been the situation with Thérèse. For what we see after Thérèse is brought home to Zélie is that she clings to Zélie in a degree that was excessive for a child of Thérèse's age. In fact, when Zélie writes to her older sister, her older daughter, Pauline, she says, there's something different about Thérèse. She's a nervous child. She's chronically apprehensive. She cries whenever I'm outside of her presence. Now, you have to read this letter within the context of a mother who's raised 9 children. She's basically saying to Pauline, there's something different about Thérèse that I did not see in the rest of you kids. It's a great trauma for any child to experience the death of her mother, but how much more traumatic it must have been for Thérèse because of previous separations. And on August 28th, 1877, when Thérèse was 4.5 years old, her worst nightmare became a reality. Her mother died. One of the ways of understanding the change that took place in Thérèse at the time of Zélie's death is to view it as an intensification and an extension of the change that had already happened before Zélie died. Just as Thérèse had clung to Zélie, now she clings to her family. Just as Thérèse could not endure being outside of her mother's presence, now she cannot endure being outside of the presence of her family. Quote, I could not bear the company of strangers and found my joy only within the intimacy of the family. After Zélie's death, Thérèse's older sister, Pauline, became Thérèse's second mother. And when you read the story of the soul, she did all the motherly acts. She became very attached to Pauline. And Thérèse, so much so that within this perspective, we can understand both the psychological and emotional trauma that Thérèse underwent at the age of 11 when Pauline left home and entered Carmel. It was like a second death. As I said a few minutes ago, Thérèse became bedridden for 6 weeks. She had hallucinations. She became paranoid, and she was not expected to live. And although Thérèse was cured by the Blessed Virgin of her sickness, Thérèse's inclination to cling to mother figures persisted. It's an inclination that she had to fight against. When she entered Carmel, she was reunited with the 2 mother figures that mothered her when she was a child, Pauline and also her third mother, Marie. And Thérèse writes in the story of his soul, I didn't come to Carmel to live with my sisters. Living with my sisters had to be the cause of continual suffering for me, when I did not wish to grant nothing to my natural inclinations. I mean, natural bonds tend to reassert themselves when people get together. In a similar way, Thérèse transferred her tendency to cling to mother figures to Mother Gonzague, who was the prioress of the monastery. Thérèse writes in her autobiography that when she was a postulant, she had to, quote, cling to the banister of the staircase as she hurried by the prioress's cell to fight the temptation of not giving in to the need to be mothered by the priors. Now, I mention this seemingly insignificant incident because we might be tempted to quickly pass over it as something that's cute. Isn't it cute that Saint Thérèse mortified herself of not seeing the prioress? But unless we know Thérèse's background, then we won't know that what Thérèse is really dealing with is a deep form of separation anxiety. And just that image of clinging to the banister speaks of not only the depth of Thérèse's anxiety, but also the strength of her will, of not giving in to it. Thérèse knew that if she gave in to it, she could have remained a little girl all of her life. However, towards the end of her life, as a result of fighting this inclination, she could write the following in Story of a Soul. How happy I am now that for having deprived myself from the beginning of my religious life, I already enjoy the reward promised to those who fight courageously. I no longer feel the necessity of refusing all human consolations, for my soul is strengthened by him who I want to love uniquely. I can see with joy that in loving him, the heart expands and can give to those who are dear to it incomparably more tenderness than if it had concentrated upon one egotistical and unfruitful love. Now, what we see here is that an emotional scar of Thérèse's childhood was not an obstacle to her growth in holiness. Rather, it became the context in which she grew in holiness because of the choices that she made in relationship to it. Thérèse was emotionally scarred and emotionally mature. And what I mean by this is that she made heroic choices not to be ruled by her feelings. And isn't this really the big fight of every day, of grappling with our emotions and making choices to do the will of God in the faces of anxiety, depression, anger? And Thérèse had a big problem with anger, as we will see. But it also needs to be pointed out that Thérèse never completely got over her inclination to cling to mother figures. Even when she was dying, in her dreams, in the anxiety of her dreams, it was Pauline, her second mother, who would come to her in her dreams to console her. I think that here Thérèse is a sign of hope for all of us. We don't have to be emotionally healed in order to grow in holiness. Emotional healing and spiritual growth are not identical. I often tell people that come to me for spiritual direction, one thing I don't want you to do is try to get over some wound in your life. That can be a good recipe for depression because you may never do so. I simply tell them, do your best to respond to the will of God in the moment. If God heals you, that's God's will. And if God doesn't, that's part of the mystery of suffering. Another aspect of the personality change that Thérèse had undergone as a result of Zélie's death was her oversensitivity. Quote, my happy disposition completely changed after Mama's death. I, once so full of life, became timid and retiring, sensitive to an excessive degree. One look was enough to reduce me to tears. And Thérèse was easily hurt, and she realized that this was a real obstacle for her to enter religious life. She writes in the autobiography, quote, I was really unbearable because of my extreme touchiness. I really don't know how I could even entertain the thought of entering Carmel when I was still in the swaddling clothes of a child, when I was still in diapers. Thérèse said that she needed a miracle of grace to overcome this sensitivity, which she received at the age of 14. When in her words, she, quote, received the grace of leaving my childhood, and when I discovered once again the strength of soul which I had lost at the age of 4.5, when her mother died. Now, in order to grasp the significance of this grace, we have to understand its nature. To do so, we need to describe what happened on December 25th, 1886, what has been called Thérèse's Christmas conversion, when Thérèse was 14 years old. It was the French custom to fill the shoes of the baby of the family with little gifts on Christmas Day. Now, though Thérèse was a week shy of her 14th birthday, and therefore this habit, this custom was age inappropriate for Thérèse, it continued in the Martin household because Thérèse was the baby of the family. Well, this particular Christmas, the Martin family is coming home from midnight mass. Louis is tired. He's taking off his coat. Céline is helping him. Thérèse is walking up the stairs. And Louis looks down and sees these shoes at the fireplace. And he sighs and groans to Céline, quote, "Thérèse ought to have outgrown all this sort of thing, and I hope this will be the last time." Céline caught Thérèse's eye as she was going up the stairs and realized that she had overheard her father's remark, a remark that Thérèse had, quote, "pierced my heart," end quote. Aware of Thérèse's sensitivity, Céline followed Thérèse upstairs. Thérèse was sitting on her bed. Her eyes were filled with tears. And Céline said to Thérèse, "Listen, Thérèse, don't go downstairs now. Get a hold of yourself. You'll just break out in tears, and you're going to ruin our Christmas." However, Thérèse recounts something. She says, quote, "I was no longer the same. Jesus had changed my heart. Forcing back my tears, I descended the stairs rapidly. Controlling the poundings of my heart, I took my slippers and placed them in front of Papa and withdrew all the objects joyfully. I had the happy appearance of a queen. Having regained his own cheerfulness, Papa was laughing. Céline believed that was all a dream. Fortunately, it was a sweet reality. Thérèse had discovered once again the strength of soul which she had lost at the age of 4.5, and she was to preserve it forever. On that night of light began the third period of my life," unquote. Now, here is an account of a teenage girl choosing to control her feelings, a seemingly insignificant event, but she considered it the turning point of her life. And it's crucial to understand, the pollen is very, very bad today, by the way, that this grace that Thérèse received did not heal Thérèse of her hypersensitivity. Rather, it gave her the strength to choose to control it. Her father's Marc had deeply hurt Thérèse. Her feelings were not changed. Rather, she was given the strength to control them. Quote, "forcing back my tears and controlling the poundings of my heart." This wasn't just a conversion on a psychological and emotional level, but there was a deep conversion on a spiritual level too. Louis was going through a bad time. He was down, and Thérèse knew it. Now, hold on to your seat, folks, because what I'm about to say might be one of the most countercultural things you'll ever hear. Thérèse went down to restore her father's happiness because she knew there was something more important in life than your feelings. And that is to love another human being. How often is it that we feed ourselves the excuse, because I feel hurt, we exempt ourselves from what God asks us to do? In this battle of her feelings, she had to fight for the rest of her life. God did not remove Thérèse from the battle of her emotions, but gave her the fortitude to remain in the battle. Freud once said that therapy ends when we're dealing with our problems and they're no longer dealing with us. I think that's a very realistic turning point in our lives. I mean, the things that I know in my life that I've been dealing with the last 60 years, I'll probably take to the grave with me. And I suspect the same is with you. We often never get beyond the major battles of our lives. At Thérèse's beatification process, her sister Pauline testified that, quote, in Carmel, Thérèse was just as sensitive to hurt as to others and found people just as annoying. She never got beyond this. She was given the strength to deal with it. Again, I think the significance of Thérèse regaining the strength to deal with her hypersensitivity without being healed of it is a part of the message of hope for all of us. Namely, that growth in holiness does not depend upon a change in feelings. Sometimes our emotions change, and sometimes they don't. Thérèse found the nuns in Lisieux Carmel just as annoying, just as irksome, just as irritating as everyone else. In fact, in her autobiography, she writes of one nun, Sister Teresa of St. Augustine, whom, in her own words, I had, quote, a natural antipathy towards. A nun who, quote, in everything, in her ways, her words, her character, everything, she annoyed me. Thérèse once called her a potted lily because she was so stiff and rigid in her personality. Now, Thérèse wrote these words in the final months of her life. She never got beyond her feelings towards this nun, but she chose to love her. Quote, I told myself that charity must not consist in feelings, but in works. Therefore, I set myself to doing for this sister what I do for any person I love the most. Have you ever considered that the person in your life whom you feel the deepest anger towards, an anger that may never go away, may be the instrument through which God intends for you to grow in charity and holiness? This may be the most important person in your spiritual life. Thérèse tells us that when her struggles, in her words, quote, became too violent, my last means of being defeated was desertion. At times, she literally could not stand the presence of this nun, and she had to meekly take herself out of the room. And I think it was a victory in two senses: the humility of accepting her limitations, and a victory as charity. If I stay here for 5 more minutes, I might say something I will regret for the next 10 years, and I have got to live with this woman. Thérèse accepted the depth of her anger. In fact, sometimes she used to go down the back staircase to avoid this sister. You ever do that in your office? Maybe the next time you do that, instead of feeling guilty about it, say, thank you, God, for giving me the grace to accept my limitations right now. Make that a prayer. Anything that we can feel guilty about, often we can turn into gratitude. Thérèse regarded the irritation that she felt towards community members not as an obstacle for growing in love. It was actually the condition for her to grow in virtues. In fact, regarding all temptations, Thérèse writes, quote, keep in mind the method that to make copper objects shine. You smear them with mud, like a real gritty mud, and after which they shine like gold. Temptations are like mud for the soul. They serve to make the virtues which are opposed to these temptations shine forth. The nun whom Thérèse was angry with by nature, I think, made Thérèse gentle by grace. This nun was the part of the mud of Thérèse's soul, that she grew in gentleness and charity. Again, I think the message is clear. Just as Thérèse lived and worked with people who irritated her, who made her furious, so do we. There's a saying in religious life that religious life is the place where the person you would never choose to live with lives, and if they die or are transferred, are immediately replaced by the same type of person. And I'm sure you can say this about your own life, your own job, you know? And as she tells us, her feelings, which she never got beyond, were part of the context of her growth in holiness, and the same is true with us. Now let's move on to another troublesome aspect of Thérèse's personality that was rooted in her childhood and remained a problem for the rest of her life, and that was her scrupulosity. And I'm not using this term lightly, okay? The cause of Thérèse's scrupulosity was a heresy called Jansenism that infected the French church. Jansenism emphasized the corruption of human nature, the feebleness of the human will, the absolute necessity of grace for salvation, and that only a chosen few were predestined to be saved. The irony of Jansenism is that its emphasis on salvation by grace alone led to the opposite extreme in practice. Namely, it spawned a very ascetical and rigoristic spirituality. This was because one needed a life of severe penance and good works to point to as a proof that you were one of the predestined saved. French Catholicism during Thérèse's lifetime was predominant in the church. Jansenism was predominant in the church. It tainted Catholic pedagogy. Sermons focused more on the justice, the severe justice of God than of mercy. And this gave rise to an excessive introspection that was the seedbed of scrupulosity. Now, in the early chapters of Story of a Soul, we have indications of an incipient scrupulosity in Thérèse. For example, Thérèse felt guilty over things that were even imperfections. And she found it very difficult to believe that she was forgiven after forgiveness was given to her. And this is something that persisted through most of her life. Now, it's very difficult to ascertain the exact source where Thérèse became infected with scrupulosity, but most probably it was a combination of the culture in general and also Zélie in particular, who was raised by a very, very scrupulous mother. But whatever the case may have been, the impress of Jansenism predisposed Thérèse for a major attack of scruples, which happened when Thérèse was 12 and a half. When she was 12 and a half, she made a retreat at the Benedictine boarding school where she went, and Father Dumin gave a very upbeat retreat, and these are the titles of his conferences: Hell, Judgment, Mortal Sin, the Necessity of Making a Good Confession, and Sacrilegious Communion. This retreat frightened Thérèse, especially when he said, quote, "How much God hated a soul that had sinned." And really, if you think of it, what guilt is the fear that somebody is looking down upon you with a harsh judgment. This retreat triggered a major attack of scruples, which lasted for 18 months a time in which she felt she had to tell every strange thought, every slightly sinful thought to her sister Marie, even thoughts about Marie herself. Now think about this. What if you had to tell another human being about every, semi-sinful thought that went through your mind? Do you know how many hours a day you'll be employed in this? I mean, Thérèse called this a martyrdom, and it really was. Now, when you read chapter 4 of Story of a Soul, where she speaks about this bout of scrupulosity, you can get the erroneous impression that after this episode, Thérèse was never troubled by scruples again. This is not true. Pauline testifies at Thérèse's beatification process, quote, "Trust in God had become Thérèse's special characteristic, but scruples came to paralyze this impetus." Thérèse was very troubled during her first few years of Carmel. This was partly because of what she heard it said in some sermons, that it was very easy to offend God and to stain one's purity of conscience. This was a real torment for her, end quote. Thérèse used to get physically sick during the community retreats because of what she heard in the conferences. Thérèse, like all of us, needed to be reassured over and over again that God is merciful. For example, there's this famous passage in chapter 8 of Story of a Soul where Father Alexis tells Thérèse that her faults did not offend God. And Thérèse tells us that his words, quote, "launched me full sail on the waves of confidence and love. My nature was such that fear made me recoil. With love, not only did I advance, but I actually flew," end quote. Again, this passage can give the erroneous impression that from this moment forward, Thérèse never recoiled in the face of her scruples. This was not the case. In a letter dated January 20th, 1893, 14 months after Thérèse heard these consoling words from Father Alexis, another priest, Father Pichon, wrote the following to Thérèse in response to her doubts about being in the state of grace even after receiving absolution in confession. Now, as I read this passage, you can almost hear Father Pichon's exasperation. I suspect this wasn't the first time that he wrote to her. "Dear child of my soul, listen to what I'm about to tell you in my name, in the part of the Lord. No, you have not committed any mortal sins. I swear it. No, you cannot sin gravely without knowing it. No, after absolution, we must not doubt about our state in grace. Banish your worries. God wills it. I command it. Take my word for it." Now, this sounds like King Lear. Listen, never have you committed a mortal sin. If you've ever had to work with a scrupulous person, you tell them one thing and they're relaxed, and 5 minutes later, the doubts come up over and over again. What are we to make of this? Here's St. Thérèse, whose spirituality proclaims the merciful love of God, who questions whether or not she is forgiven after God absolves her in confession. I think to understand what looks like a contradiction, we have to make a distinction between believing that God is merciful and feeling that God is merciful. I think it's very consoling to know that even St. Thérèse didn't always feel that God was merciful and forgiving. What we see here is that even the saints who were critics of their culture were also impacted by it. Even though Thérèse's proclamation of merciful love was an antidote to the poison of the merciless God of Jansenism, she still was infected by it. Thérèse, like all of us, no matter how deeply we may think that we believe in a merciful God, at times we really question, especially in times of guilt, especially when we hear maybe a fire and brimstone sermon, or we are yelled at in confession for something that we're ashamed of. We begin to wonder whether God is merciful. Thérèse, like all of us, never completely got beyond the impact of her childhood and culture. She knew that she was scrupulous. And one of the ways that she proved her belief in merciful love is even when at times she felt she had committed mortal sin, she would go to communion. Quote, "I was given the grace to receive communion even when I believed that I committed great sins." She knew that her scruples were really neurotic guilt. And she had to make a choice. Am I going to act as if I believe in a merciful God, or am I going to act upon my feelings? In short, Thérèse had the courage to act upon her belief in the face of her feelings by choosing to bear her neurotic guilt that she offered to God. Often it's not going to go away. What do you do with it? Offer that suffering to God. That's exactly what Thérèse did. Now, for a guilt-ridden Irish Catholic boy like myself, that's good news, and I suspect it's true for many of you. Again, what we see is that Thérèse is a sign of hope for all of us, that holiness is not dependent upon whether or not we are healed of our emotional problems, but are we cooperating with God's grace in the midst of them and doing God's will? Don't judge your spiritual life with an emotional yardstick. Finally, let's briefly look at the last 18 months of Thérèse's life, when she was dying a very, very painful death of tuberculosis and suffered severe doubts about eternal life, what has been called her trial of faith. Let me begin with a series of quotes that are taken from this period of her life. Quote, "I don't believe in eternal life. It seems to me that after this mortal life there is nothing anymore. Last evening I was seized with a veritable anguish and my darkness increased. A voice inside of me said, 'Are you sure of being loved by God? Did he come and tell you?' It seems to me that the darkness, borrowing the voice of sinners, says mockingly to me, 'You are dreaming about the light and about the fatherland embalmed in the sweetest perfumes. You are dreaming about the eternal possession of the Creator of all these marvels. You believe that one day you will walk out of this fog that surrounds you? Advance. Advance. Rejoice in death, which will not give you what you hope for, but a night still profound, a night of nothingness.'" Sartre could have written this. "Frightful thoughts obsess me. It's the reasoning of the worst materialists which are imposed upon my mind." When Thérèse woke up on Good Friday morning, 1896, 18 months before she died, and blood was coming out of her mouth, the first sign that she had contracted tuberculosis, she was filled with joy at the prospect of going to heaven. However, within less than 48 hours, she was submerged in the darkness and doubts about the existence of eternal life. Now, these doubts were not peculiar to this time in Thérèse's life. For example, during her retreat of 1891, 5 years prior to the onset of her trial of faith, Thérèse writes, quote, "At that time I was having great interior trials of all kinds, even to the point of asking myself whether heaven really existed." Thus, we should actually see Thérèse's, quote, trial of faith as an intensification and prolongation of what she suffered many times throughout her life. Thérèse, like all of us, I think, are plagued from time to time about whether death is our final destiny, whether everything ends at the grave. And perhaps more so than many of us, for two reasons. First, Thérèse was a precociously intelligent and reflective child who spent long periods of time thinking about the ultimate questions of life. For example, when she was 10 or 11 years old and she was at the boarding school, one of her teachers asked her, "Thérèse, what do you do on your free time?" And Thérèse said, "Well, I go behind my bed, close myself in my curtains, and I think." And the nun said, "What do you think about?" And Thérèse says, quote, "I think about God. I think about life. I think about eternity. I think." And this is a 10-year-old kid. And also, Thérèse, when she was young, she said that she devoured books on science and history. And in the 19th century, advances in science and technology that became wedded to a Darwinian vision of evolution and progress questioned the relevancy of religion, which can be summed up in the following words by Thérèse, quote, "Science is unceasingly making new advances. Science will eventually explain everything naturally. We shall have the absolute reason for everything that exists, and that still remains a problem," end quote. It's the feeling that the abstract speculations of the philosophers and the outworn creed of Catholicism is irrelevant. Just give science and reason enough time, and they'll explain everything away naturally. These were some of Thérèse's thoughts. These last 18 months of Thérèse's life was the worst of time viewed physically and emotionally, but the best of times if we look at her life from a spiritual perspective. Because during this time, Thérèse's spirit expanded under the impact of grace. During her trial of faith, Thérèse came to know that everything is a grace from God, even the grace to believe. Immediately prior to her trial of faith, the possibility that anyone could not believe in heaven was beyond Thérèse's comprehension. She writes, quote, "I was unable to believe that there were really impious people who had no faith. I actually believed that they were speaking against their own inner convictions when they denied the existence of heaven." However, as a result of her trial of faith, Thérèse came to call agnostics and atheists her brothers and sisters. Now, in the passage that I'm about to read, the phrase "poor sinners" was used by French Catholics of Thérèse's day to refer to agnostics and atheists. "Your child, however, O Lord, has understood your divine light, and she begs pardon for her brothers. She is resigned to eat the bread of sorrow as long as you desire it. She does not wish to rise up from this table filled with bitterness at which poor sinners are eating, until the day set by you. Can she not say, therefore, in her name and in the name of her brothers, have pity on us, O Lord, for we are poor sinners. Clearly, Thérèse, during her trial of faith, Thérèse knew what it felt to live in a godless universe, a universe that's a dead-end street, a road that leads to nowhere. In fact, Thérèse once referred to the philosopher Nietzsche as her sick little brother. Thérèse participated in the skepticism of her age with all of its attending anguish and dread. When I hear that Thérèse was in solidarity with the agnostics and atheists of her day, my first response is, so what? Experiencing the darkness and anguish of other people is not itself redemptive. Great, we have one more anxious and depressed person to deal with. That's all it says. But what is important were the choices that Thérèse made in the face of her darkness. That's what made her trial of faith redemptive. It was how Thérèse related to her darkness that made it a participation in the Paschal mystery. Again, it wasn't a question of Thérèse getting beyond the darkness of doubt. Rather, it was how she related to it. Thérèse did not simply endure the darkness, she chose to embrace it. Hers was not a stoical abdication to fate, but an acceptance of the cross. She writes, she is resigned to eat the bread of sorrows as long as you desire it, my God. She does not wish to rise up from this table filled with bitterness at which poor sinners are eating until the day set by you. You know, we can say that there are two forms of faith. The first is our willingness to jump into the darkness. That is, choosing to trust in God's guidance when we venture into the unknown. And I think the second is our willingness to sit in the darkness, which is continuing to do God's will when our emotional resources are depleted and life seems hollow and meaningless and absurd. And Thérèse was willing to sit in this darkness as long as God willed. The darkness of Thérèse's trial of faith was the context of surrendering to God's will and uniting herself to Jesus upon the cross. My God, why have you abandoned me? And Thérèse found meaning in her night of meaninglessness by simply offering her darkness to God for the salvation of others. Thérèse had a deep belief in the church as the mystical body of Christ. And I think that's something we've kind of lost today, you know, in all the things that are happening in the church as an institution, that the church as the mystical body of Christ, that we're all united with Jesus in his body, and that whatever we do, no matter how private, in some mysterious way that we never understand, can impact the lives of other people. Thérèse's faith came to fruition at the point at which she had almost lost it. As theologian Karl Rahner says of Thérèse, quote, here's a person who died in the mortal temptation to empty belief right down to the roots of her being, and in that condition believed, end quote. Thérèse's doubts of faith were not antithetical to her faith, but the context in which her faith matured. These are the worst of times in our life of faith, viewed from a psychological and emotional perspective. But from a spiritual perspective, they are potentially the best of times. For when we continue to do God's will without emotional support, in darkness, our love of God and neighbor grows and is purified. Thérèse expressed this truth in her poem, A Gloss on the Divine, which she composed during her night of faith. She writes, quote, "Without support, yet with support, living without light in darkness, I am wholly being consumed by love. I have no other support than my God, and now I proclaim what I value near him is to see and feel my soul supported without any support." In this poem, I think Thérèse touches upon one of the paradoxes of the spiritual life, namely that it's at the point when we are devoid of all human support and we continue to say yes to God that we experience a support that is beyond the human. In those times of our lives when we do not have a drop of energy left to love our neighbor, if we say yes to God, a divine energy and strength and grace is given to us. And real charity, which is the very life of God, came to perfection in Thérèse during her night of faith while she was dying of tuberculosis. Without the support of physical health or affect, Thérèse chose to love her neighbor with what she called, quote, an unfelt love, which is a love that issues from the will alone. To give one example, Thérèse volunteered to work with Sister Marie of St. Joseph, a deeply emotionally disturbed nun whom everyone in the convent tried to avoid. A nun that eventually had to leave the convent because of the deterioration of her mental illness. And Thérèse never sugarcoated Sister Marie of St. Joseph. In fact, she once said of her, quote, "She's like a broken clock that has to be rewound every 15 minutes. Yes, it's as bad as that. If I had such a defective spirit as this woman has, I would not have done any better, and then I would have despaired." Thus, at the lowest point of Thérèse's life, physically and emotionally speaking, Thérèse was given the strength to freely love the most difficult person in her community. And in the process, love came to perfection within her. This sketchy presentation of some of the aspects of St. Thérèse's life, I think, can be summed up in a letter by Leo the Great referring to the mystery of the Incarnation. He writes, quote, "The conqueror's victory would have profited us nothing if the battle had been fought outside our human condition," end quote. I think many people erroneously believe that in order to grow in holiness, somehow they need to transcend the human condition or to get beyond it. I think the freeing truth about Thérèse's life is that we need not get over the emotional woundedness of our lives in order to grow in holiness, and that the physical illnesses and spiritual darknesses are not obstacles to spiritual growth. All of them are aspects of the human condition in which we are called to respond to God's grace. Thank you very much.